I appreciate you being nice, but I'm really not a fan of IQ tests and have never actually taken one, so couldn't answer that question. Firstly, the history of IQ is absolutely flooded with eugenics. The first attempt to measure intelligence was put forward by eugenicist Francis Galton, literally the guy who came up with the term eugenics. Then in 1904, the intelligence test took a brief turn for the good when French psychologist Alfred Binet developed the Binet-Simons test. He was asked by the French government to come up with a way to identify children that were falling behind developmentally and needed help. He believed that intelligence was not static, and identifying children who needed extra help would get them the help they needed. He also believed that intelligence was way too complicated a subject to be boiled down and quantified with a single number, and that it changes over time and can only be compared in children with similar backgrounds. Well, then they went right back into the hands of eugenicists. American psychologist Lewis Terman adapted it into a test called the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scales. Soonly, during World War I, IQ tests were being used by the United States military on new recruits to determine placement for officer training. The tests were administered to over 1.7 million soldiers. They were extremely culturally biased and bolstered inaccurate racist generalizations about entire groups of people. Soon after that, the state of Virginia enacted a policy that allowed for the forced sterilization of people with low IQ, deeming them feeble-minded. And the Supreme Court upheld that law with the 1927 decision Buck v. Bell. By 1956, 24 states had laws that allowed for involuntary sterilization, and that led to the forced sterilization of over 59,000 people. So yeah, the history of eugenics is a real big issue I have with IQ. Secondly, IQ is not the same thing as intelligence, and there's no single agreed upon definition for intelligence. IQ generally specifically tests for abstract, linguistic, and logical mathematical reasoning. Basically, they're valid in predicting academic performance, but that's about it. But here's the thing, there are many different types of intelligence. And even if you only consider what it actually tests for, a huge factor is motivation to do well on the test itself. This study reviewed 46 previous experiments and found that when incentives like money are offered, IQ tests are raised significantly. Like about 2/3 of a standard deviation, or around 10 IQ points, and 15 points for people who initially scored under 100. Also, IQ tests are inherently culturally biased, and group differences are best explained by access to quality education and exposure to shit that's on IQ tests. For example, a brief training session on Raven's progressive matrices improved the scores of black South Africans by 14 points, but only improved the scores of white South Africans by 4 points. And lastly, I really don't see any everyday utility for IQ. You got a high IQ score? So what? It doesn't make you any better than somebody with a low IQ score. You got a low IQ score? So what? It doesn't make you any worse than somebody with a high IQ score. I just don't think it's ever really helpful to see people as too smart or too dumb for anything. Intelligence is some complicated shit and it's easy to be reductive about it. So yeah,